The sky above the alien city shimmered, with hues of violet and deep indigo stars hanging low as if watching the events unfold. The air carried a scent unlike anything on Earth, a fusion of exotic spices and something faintly metallic. Towering structures of smooth bioluminescent stone stretched into the sky, glowing in rhythmic pulses, reflecting the life of the city below. The streets were filled with them, tall, elegant beings with luminous markings running along their necks, shoulders, and down their backs. Their skin had a soft, almost iridescent sheen, shifting subtly under the city's ethereal glow. They moved with grace, their eyes gleaming with intelligence, but there was something else beneath the surface: curiosity, caution, and something unspoken. When they glanced at him, the only human, Rael stepped cautiously through the towering gates, feeling the weight of 100 gazes settle on him. He had arrived only a few days ago, an explorer stranded in a world that seemed to defy every expectation. The people here, the Zeri, had welcomed him with a mixture of fascination and hesitation. They had never seen a human before. Whispers followed him as he passed through the market district, where shimmering claws hung in midair, suspended by invisible forces. Beings adorned in delicate silks of colors beyond Earth's spectrum watched him with intense, tense, piercing gazes, some with curiosity, some with disdain. But one gaze felt different. From a balcony above, a woman stood, her presence in undeniable force. She was unlike the others, not just in beauty, but in aura. Her skin was a mesmerizing shade of midnight blue, with streaks of silver markings pulsing gently along her collar. Her eyes, deep and luminous, locked onto his with an intensity that sent a strange chill down his spine. A princess, a noble, a priestess, he wasn't sure, but the way the others parted around her told him she was someone important. Rael was about to look away when she moved, effortless, fluid-like. Gravity barely applied to her. She descended the stairs, her long flowing robes trailing behind her. The closer she came, the more he noticed the subtle glow emanating from her skin, a reaction to something. To him, the crowd fell silent as she reached him, standing inches away. She was tall, nearly eye level with him, her form both delicate and impossibly strong. Then she spoke. Her voice was a soft, melodic whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. "You are not meant to be here." Ra's throat went dry. "And yet, here I am," he managed to say, holding her gaze. A flicker of something crossed her face: amusement, interest. It was impossible to tell. Then, to his shock, she extended her hand. "Come with me." He wasn't sure why he followed her. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the way her touch had left a lingering warmth against his skin, as if something had awakened between them. She led him through the winding halls of what he assumed was a temple or a palace. The walls pulsed with veins of soft silver light, breathing in time with something unseen. Finally, they stopped at a sanctum, an open space where the floor shimmered like liquid glass, reflecting the stars above. She turned to face him, and for the first time there was no audience, only them. "You do not know what you are," she said, her voice softer now. "What you are capable of." Ra frowned. "I'm just a man." Her eyes darkened, something like frustration flashing through them. "You are more." She took a step closer, her glowing markings brightening slightly as she reached out, fingertips hovering just above his skin. Rael felt his pulse quicken. The air between them crackled with something unseen, something neither of them fully understood. Then she touched him. A shudder ran through her entire body. Her breath hitched, her lips parting in shock as her luminescent markings flared with a light so intense that the entire chamber flickered. She staggered back, eyes wide, staring at him as if he had just done something impossible. Ra's breath was unsteady. What was that? Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her own skin, as if trying to control whatever was happening inside her. She whispered, her voice barely audible. "You changed something in me." Rael took a step forward, concern laced in his expression. "Are you okay?" She shook her head, her gaze flickering with something almost desperate. Her fingers clenched at the fabric of her robes, and then, to his utter shock, she reached for him again. "Do it again." Ra hesitated, But the way she looked at him, a mixture of hunger and disbelief, sent a deep pulse of intrigue. Through his veins, he reached out fingers, brushing against her wrist. This time, it wasn't a subtle reaction. Her entire body tensed, her lips parting in a sharp gap. A gasp as a visible ripple of energy coursed through her skin, her luminous markings glowing in waves of violet and silver. Ra's mind raced. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just ATT traction. Something was happening to her because of him, and then as her body trembled beneath his touch, she whispered something that sent a shock straight to his core. Don't stop. Her voice was raw, breathless, pleading. Ra's heart pounded, realization crashing into him. This wasn't just about him. This was something far greater, far deeper, something that could change everything. The silence between them was deafening. Rael stood frozen, his mind racing to process what had just happened. His touch, his mere presence had elicited something in her, something so primal, so intense that she could barely contain it. She trembled before him, her luminous markings pulsing in erratic waves along her collarbone, trailing down her arms. The glow was brighter than before, almost hypnotic, each pulse revealing the way her body reacted to him. Don't stop. Her breathless plea sent a deep shiver through him. Rael swallowed hard. This was dangerous. He had no idea what was happening, no understanding of what he had triggered inside her, but the way her body responded, the way she clung to control, yet craved more, it sent a wave of heat and curiosity rushing through him. Are you sure? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. She exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening at the fabric of her robes. The struggle within her was clear. This wasn't supposed to happen. Whatever this was, her kind wasn't meant to experience it. Yet she did with him. Her violet eyes lifted to meet his, and in them he saw a storm of emotions: fear, excitement, desire. I need to understand, she murmured. I need to know why my body reacts to you this way. Ra wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to herself, but when she closed the space between them, her breathing uneven, her fingers costing over his skin again, he knew there was no stopping this. Her fingers skimmed over his wrist first, as if testing the sensation. The moment her skin made contact, her entire body shuddered violently. A soft, barely contained gasp slipping past her lips. Her markings flared so brightly that the entire chamber was bathed in their glow. Rael felt it too, a rush of warmth unlike anything he'd ever experienced. A strange, tingling sensation spread from where she touched him, like an invisible current flowing between them. This wasn't normal. Her species wasn't supposed to react like this, yet she did. Her lips parted, her chest rising and falling rapidly. As her body struggled to contain what was happening, she pressed a hand to her heart, her breath catching. This is impossible, she whispered. Ra's gaze flickered over her, watching as she tried to steady herself. What do you feel? He asked, her hands clenched at her sides, her body still trembling. She was struggling to speak. It's overwhelming, she finally admitted. No one from my kind, no one has ever felt something like this. She looked up at him again, her eyes wild with emotion. And I don't want it to stop. Something inside Rael snapped. He wasn't sure if it was her words, the way she looked at him, or the heat rolling off her skin, but he reached for her this time deliberately, and the moment his fingers traced along her arm, she broke. Her entire body arched, her knees nearly buckling, her lips parting in a sharp gasp. Her glowing markings pulsed wildly, shifting colors in rapid succession. Silver, violet, deep indigo. Rael's breath hitched. This wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something primal. She clutched his forearm, her grip almost desperate, as if she was grounding herself in him again. She whispered, please. Rael knew this was dangerous. He knew they were treading into territory neither of them understood, but he couldn't stop. His fingers glided down her arm feather, and the moment he reached her wrist, her markings ignited again, her body jerking involuntarily against him. She was breathing fast now, her skin practically humming beneath his touch. Ra had never seen anything like it. She wasn't just experiencing pleasure. Her body was evolving to feel things. It was never meant to because of him. Her head fell forward, resting against his shoulder, her voice a trembling whisper. No human has ever touched my kind this way. Russ swallowed hard. No, she shook her head. Number, and I think I would die if they did. His body tensed at her words. What do you mean? She slowly lifted her head, her breath brushing against his skin. Her eyes burned with emotion. You're different. Rael, you don't just touch me, you awaken something in me. Her fingers lifted, trembling as she traced his jaw. The second she made contact, her legs buckled completely. Rael caught her before she could collapse, his arms around her waist. As she sagged against him, her markings flashed wildly, her body still trembling. She clung to him desperately, like she was afraid to let go. I don't understand, she whispered, but I don't want it to stop. Neither did he, but he had the strangest feeling this was only the beginning. The air between them remained charged, thick with something neither of them could explain. Rael still held her close, his arms wrapped securely around her trembling form. Her luminescent markings pulsed erratically, each flicker betraying the intensity of what she felt. She wasn't just shaken, she was transformed. Her violet eyes lifted to meet his, still dark with emotion. You have changed me. Ra's heartbeat thundered in his chest. He could feel the way her body clung to his presence, as if pulling from him a sensation she had never known before. What does that mean? He asked cautiously. Her breath hitched, her glowing fingers tightening around his forearm, as if anchoring herself. It means that I am no longer like the others. A cold shiver ran through him. No longer like the others. Rael wasn't sure what that meant, but deep down, he knew this was dangerous. She inhaled sharply and stepped back, breaking the contact between them. The moment she did, her body visibly tensed, her markings flickering erratically. It was as if her very existence fought against the absence of his touch. Her expression darkened with realization. They will know. Ra's jaw tightened. Who? Before she could answer, a sudden chime echoed through the air, low, rhythmic, foreboding. Her eyes widened in horror. Then within moments the room darkened, the silver glow that had pulsed along the walls dimmed to nothing, replaced by an eerie silence. Then they arrived. Figures in flowing robes emerged from the shadows, their glowing markings a deep shade of sapphire. Their expressions were unreadable, but the weight of their presence suffocated the air. Rael clenched his fists. He wasn't alone anymore. The woman beside him, the one who had just pleaded for his touch moments ago, now looked frozen. The confident, commanding aura she had held before was replaced by something else. Fear. A male figure stepped forward, taller than the others, his markings glowing with authority. His gaze locked onto her first, then shifted to Rael, eyes narrowing. You have broken a law more ancient than time itself. Rael felt a pulse of anger surge through him. A law? What law? The alien man's gaze never wavered. You are human. His voice carried the weight of centuries, and no human has ever touched Azori this way. Ra's jaw clenched. Why? What would happen? The elder's gaze darkened, and then his attention shifted back to her, the woman who had touched him so desperately. You know the consequences, child. Rael saw her body stiffen. She was trying to fight back whatever was raging inside her, but she was losing. Her fingers twitched at her sides, glowing erratically as if some unseen force was pulling at her. Please, she whispered. I didn't know. The elder's expression remained cold. You did, and yet you allowed it. Rael had heard enough. He stepped forward, positioning himself between her and the elders. She didn't do anything wrong. His voice was firm. If you want to blame someone, blame me. The elder's gaze flicked to him, unimpressed. You don't understand. Human. Ra's chest heaved with frustration. Then explain it to me. The elder studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. If Azeri bonds with a human, they can never return to what they were before. Ray felt his stomach drop. What? The elder turned his gaze back to her, his voice low, full of ancient weight. You are already changing. You feel it, don't you? She trembled. Yes. Ra's mind raised. What did they mean? What was happening to her? The elder exhaled. Air's body and mind are not meant to respond to external species. We were designed to remain untouched, pure. Rael's fist clenched. That's the elder's expression didn't change, and yet look at her. Ra's breath caught as he turned to her. She was struggling. Her markings flashed wildly, her entire form shivering, as if trying to hold something back. I don't want to stop feeling this way, she finally Admitted voice, Ra's heart ached. At the pain in her eyes, she wasn't just afraid of them, she was afraid of losing. Whatever this was between them, the elder sighed. You will not have a choice, child. The bond is not permanent yet. If you sever it now, you may return to what you were, but if you continue, his gaze flickered to Rail, you will never be the same. Silence fell between them. Rail's fists trembled. This was more than just attraction, more than just chemistry. This was something no one had ever encountered before. The woman's lips parted, her breath uneven. And if I refuse to sever it, the elder's eyes darkened. Then you will be exiled from your kind. Ray's stomach twisted. Exile. He turned to her, expecting hesitation, but instead, he saw something else. Determination. Her violet gaze burned with something fierce, something raw. She took a step forward, ignoring the warning glances of the elder. Her hands lifted, not trembling this time, as she placed them firmly on Raz's chest. A sharp shock wave of warmth coursed through his body, sending a deep shudder down his spine. The elders gasped. Her markings flared so brightly that the entire chamber illuminated. She had chosen, and she had chosen him. The elder's voice was dark, full of finality. Then you have sealed your fate. The moment she touched him, the entire chamber trembled with an unseen force. Her luminous markings surged with intensity, flaring in cascading waves of violet and silver. The elders recoiled in shock, their expressions twisting into something that resembled fear. No Zeri had ever reacted this way before. Rail barely had time to process it before a searing warmth shot through his body. Unlike anything he had felt before, it wasn't pain, but something more, something deeper. His mind swam as his pulse raced, his senses locking onto hers, as though the universe itself had decided they were meant to be one. Her breath was ragged, her fingers clutching the fabric of his tunic, as if she were holding on to the only thing keeping her grounded. The elders stepped forward, their voices sharp enough, but she didn't release him. If anything, she tightened her grip. Rail saw it in her eyes, a silent war raging. Inside of her, she was changing, transforming, becoming something even she didn't fully understand. But instead of fear, there was longing. Her voice wavered, but there was no hesitation in her words. I can't stop. A pulse of raw energy rippled from her body, radiating outward in a wave that sent a crack splintering through the floor beneath them. The elders staggered back, stunned by what they were witnessing. Rail's breath hitched as her nails dug into his shoulders. Please don't let me go. He didn't. His arms circled around her, steadying her trembling form. She exhaled, shuddering against him, her entire body melting into his. For a long moment, nothing else existed, only the fire coursing between them, the gravity that pulled them together like an unstoppable force. Then she gasped, a sharp, breathless sound, as if she had just touched something forbidden. Her markings flared even brighter, and she collapsed against his chest, her body convulsing in reaction. It was too much, too overwhelming. The connection between them had gone beyond anything she had ever known, and yet she whispered two words that sent a jolt of heat through Rail's spine. Don't stop. The elders' voices rose in protest, but Rad ignored them. He felt the way her body trembled beneath his fingers, the way her breath hitched as he held her closer, grounding her. I won't. Her violet eyes met his, wide, desperate. She was unraveling in his arms, the barriers that once separated their species crumbling like dust. The connection had deepened into something irreversible. She clutched his tunic, whispering against his skin, I don't care about the laws. Her body arched instinctively, the warmth between them rising to a breaking point. The elders could do nothing but watch in silent horror as the once untouchable Zer-Noble surrendered completely to something she was never meant to feel. Another pulse of energy rippled through her. Her body tensed, then softened as her markings flashed in one final burst of light. The transformation was complete. She was no longer Solari. She was something more, and she belonged to him now. The silence that followed was deafening. The air around them was thick with residual energy, an unseen force still humming between their bodies. Ray could feel it beneath his skin, a raw electric sensation that refused to fade. It was like she had imprinted herself onto him, her presence, an unshakable part of him, Now and her she was utterly changed. Her body no longer trembled in confusion, no longer fought against the overwhelming sensations racking through her. Instead she stood, still, her breathing heavy, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Her markings had stopped pulsing. They no longer flickered erratically, nor did they glow in response to the presence of her people. Instead, they remained a constant, steady burn of deep violet, as if claiming their final form. She wasn't Zeri anymore. She wasn't human either. She was something new. Ray could feel the weight of the elders' stares pressing against them, their shock and horror hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. No words were spoken, but their expression said everything. She had become something that should not exist. One of the elders, the tallest among them, took a slow step forward, his expression grim. You have doomed yourself. The words were spoken with such finality that Rael's body instinctively tensed, his arms tightening around her, as if shielding her from an unseen attack. She did not move away from him. Instead, she stood taller, straighter, her fingers curled against Rael's chest, her touch firm, deliberate. I have freed myself. Her voice carried no fear. The elder's lips pressed into a thin line. You do not understand the weight of what you have done. Rael could feel the tension crackling around them, a storm brewing beneath the surface. The Zuri were not an aggressive species, but something told him that this moment, this act of defiance, was something they would not forgive. She had chosen a path that had never been walked before, and she had done it for him. He turned his gaze toward her, searching her expression for any sign of hesitation. There was none, only certainty, only him. The elder exhaled sharply before turning to address the silent crowd of Zuri that had gathered at the chamber's entrance. Their glowing eyes flickered with uncertainty, their minds struggling to process what had happened. Finally, the elder spoke. She is no longer one of us. The word struck harder than any blow. Rael's breath caught in his throat as she visibly flinched, her fingers curling tighter against him. Her own people were casting her out. Her shoulders straightened, but Rael could feel the tremor running through her fingers. This was her home, her people, and now she was losing them all because of him. He could see the conflict behind her eyes, the silent war raging within her. The weight of her decision was crushing. She had defied everything. She knew she had chosen the impossible. But now she was facing the cost. Rael's jaw tightened, anger burning in his chest. He knew what he had to do. He reached for her hand. She gasped softly as his fingers interlocked with hers, her markings flaring in response. The connection between them was still there, still alive. Ray turned to face the elders. Then she isn't one of you anymore. The elder narrowed his eyes. And what does that make her human? Ra's grip on her hand tightened. He didn't hesitate. Mind. The words settled over the room like a slow burning wildfire. The crowd murmured in hushed tones the weight of the declaration, sending ripples through their carefully constructed world. She inhaled sharply beside him, her fingers tightening around his. He felt the tremor in her breath, the unspoken words trapped in her throat. But she didn't protest. She didn't let go. The elder's expression remained unreadable, but the way his glowing eyes darkened spoke volumes. Then you will leave this place. You will leave this world. Neither of you can remain. Rael's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He had suspected as much, but hearing the words still sent a heavy weight crashing down on him. Exile. She had lost everything for him, and now she was about to lose her home as well. His gaze flickered to her, watching for any sign of regret. Instead, she lifted her chin, her expression unwavering. Then so be it. Ra exhaled. She wasn't afraid, neither was he. The elder motioned toward the great doors at the far end of the chamber. A final command: go. There was no ceremony, no further warning, only the cold, indifferent silence of a world that was pushing them out. Ray felt a swell of emotion surge within him: anger, frustration, a sharp ache in his chest that he didn't quite understand. But then she turned to him, her violent gaze steady. She wasn't looking back. She wasn't hesitating. She had already made her choice, and Rael knew then, in that moment, that he was never going to let her go. Not now, not ever. The cold wind howled through the open valley as Rael and the woman he now called his own Stee. Beyond the towering city walls, the glow of the Zuri stronghold faded behind them. swallowed by the endless stretch of twilight sky and the vast expanse of alien wilderness. She didn't look back. Neither did he. Her fingers remained laced with his, her grip firm, certain. There was no doubt in her anymore, no hesitation, no regret. She had been cast out, exiled, stripped of her people and her home, and yet for the first time she was free. Rai glanced at her, watching the way her glowing markings had settled into a steady, permanent hue. They no longer flickered in confusion or fear. They burned with something stronger now. Acceptance, purpose, love. A soft exhale left her lips, and she turned to him with a small, almost hesitant smile. We survived. Ra let out a breathless chuckle. Yeah, we did. She studied him for a moment, her eyes tracing his face as if memorizing him all over again. Then, slowly, she reached up and touched his chest, right above his heart. A warm pulse spread through his body, tingling beneath his skin. The connection between them was still there, alive and undeniable. I feel you, she whispered, her voice full of quiet awe. Rail covered her hand with his own. I feel you too. For a long moment neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. She had chosen him, he had chosen her. Now all that was left was the future, a future they would build together. The journey away from the city was long, but they weren't alone. As the days passed, others began to appear. Zeri, who had watched what had happened, who had questioned the laws that had cast her out. They came in small groups, at first hesitant but curious. Some had seen the way she had changed, and for the first time they wanted to know what it meant. By the time they reached the outermost edges of the land, there were dozens of them, exiles, seekers, dreamers. They had left behind the old ways just as she had. She stood among them, her head high, her violet eyes filled with quiet pride. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about a new way of life. Rail turned to her, a slow grin spreading across his face. Looks like you started a revolution. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. I didn't start anything. I just followed my heart. Ra's fingers traced along the inside of her wrist, and her breath hitched just slightly at the sensation. Her markings flared, and her lips parted in a soft gasp. The reaction was instant, powerful. No matter how many times they touched, it never faded. He pulled her closer, his voice low. And where does your heart lead you now? She exhaled, pressing her forehead to his. Wherever you are. He smiled. Good, because I don't ever plan on letting you go. Her lips brushed against his in response, a silent promise. Together they had left behind the past. Together they had built something new, and together they would carve a future where love had no limits, no boundaries, no rules, only them. Forever.